If you lived before our time, who would you be? What if you could choose from 1,000 yesterdays, when the past was today and the new took your breath away? Who would you be? How would you live? Who would you love? Living every generation before us, remembering for generations to come. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
Hi, I'm Arthur Kent. Welcome to the History Channel. For most of us, our first contact with cash is from a bank or an ATM machine. But do you ever consider the fact that cash is money only because we believe it's money? Actually, all Federal Reserve notes, like this $20 bill, and most coins in circulation are money because the government says they are, not because they're backed by precious metals. Tonight, we're going to take you inside a world where people specialize in taking advantage of that faith, the world of the counterfeiter. Only now, the amateurs are as savvy as the pros. Join us as the History Channel presents Making a Buck.
If you undermine the public's confidence in money, you can create just as much havoc as you could with a 500-pound bomb.
A counterfeiter is actually waging economic warfare on all of his fellow citizens.
Counterfeiting and treason are the only two crimes mentioned in the Constitution. And I think that's for a reason.
Counterfeiting is a crime of greed, and usually being greedy is what gets people caught.
Everybody wants to have a money tree in the backyard, and it's a nice thought to think that you wouldn't have to earn it, you could just roll it out of the printer.
This is John, and he is a convicted counterfeiter. He's agreed to let us tell his story on the condition that we change his name and conceal his identity. His is a tale of ambition, greed, and easy access to a color copier. The portrait, in other words, of a counterfeiting everyman. His story begins in the mid-1990s when he was working as an event promoter in Springfield, Illinois, about 200 miles southwest of Chicago. A one-time road manager for the rock band Head East, John set his sights on producing a 4th of July music fair that would rival anything the area had ever seen.
It was my desire to put together just a full-blown 5-day festival that would basically just be, true to its name, MegaFest.
John sank everything he had into his dream. He spent money on the venue, the advertising, and the bands, booking nationally known acts like Billy Ray Cyrus. By the time the gates opened on July 3rd, 1996, he was $100,000 in the hole. At first, it looked like his risk might pay off. Opening night was a triumph.
I'm getting headlines that are 4 inches, big type, MegaFest, mega hit. Everybody was on board, everyone loved it because it all went off without a hitch. Life was good until we got to about the 4th day.
It was then that the ugly truth set in. Attendance was running way behind projections. The money from ticket and concession sales was barely enough to pay the bills, let alone turn a profit.
It was like flowing into my counting trailer and right back out the door to keep fueling the engine. When it all came down to it, you had everyone paid, but my investment was completely gone.
When MegaFest ended, John found himself at a crossroads.
In hindsight, that's the moment in time I should have thrown in the towel and just said, this one didn't go. But I had thoroughly made up in my mind that I would not be defeated. You know, I'm going to make this thing happen next year.
At this point, we should make it perfectly clear that counterfeiting is a federal crime, punishable by up to 15 years in prison. The reason for the disclaimer is that the thing that inspired John to break the law was a TV documentary on counterfeiting.
This documentary program was nothing more than a crash course on how to make money, how to actually physically make the counterfeit money. And it explored all the various ways. And that's probably when the light bulb went on.
Many of us have imagined what it would be like to be a counterfeiter. The fantasy of being able to churn out money at will, of beating the government at its own game, is what makes it such a romantic crime. But until very recently, the paradox of counterfeiting was that making easy money took an awful lot of work.
There's no question that old-time printers really did consider themselves artists, if you will. I mean, I've arrested people who were looking at felony prison charges, very serious offenses, and they were very interested to know how their counterfeit money stacked up, if you will, against other counterfeit denominations we had seen.
In the last few years, everything's changed. New technology has sparked an explosion in so-called casual counterfeiting. Thanks to computers and color copiers, a crime everyone's thought about has become a crime anyone can do.
You don't have to spend the hours that you had to perfecting the process and the quality of the note. You literally can sit down at your computer or with a color copier or a high-resolution output device and come up with a fairly deceptive counterfeit note.
So that was John's answer. If he couldn't raise the money for MegaFest 2, he'd make it himself. All he needed to get started were a few boxes of paper and a $40,000 color copier, which an office supply store provided free for a 2-week trial period. With his girlfriend out of town, John turned his living room into a counterfeiting laboratory.
I had made the decision to try, but I wasn't convinced I could do it. And so I sat there off and on, experimenting with the machine until I got something that just literally blew me away. It wasn't perfect, but it was close. And once you ruffled it up a little bit, once you got it damp, it was real close.
John printed the old 50s and the new hundreds, which had only recently been introduced into circulation. The more he printed, the more nervous he became.
I've got money laying all over the house, and Paperboy would come to the front door and I'd freak out and be scrambling around the house picking all this up.
There were other unexpected problems, like disposing the mistakes.
You know, what do you do with all the scraps? You can't put it in the garbage. I had this huge garbage sack full of 50s and 100s that were just not quite there. And so I ended up going down to a local river and sat there and made a bonfire of 50s and 100s.
In the end, John printed out more than $160,000 worth of fake bills, carefully trimming them with a paper cutter.
Once I had that briefcase full of money, that was that moment of realization that, Christ, I'm going to do this. And that's the line you cross, you know. That's when you say, I am going to go out and break the law.
In early September 1996, John left Springfield with a van load of homemade cash. His plan was to spend the fakes in cities throughout the Midwest, pocketing real money in change. If nothing went wrong, his shopping spree would net a 90% profit and pay for MegaFest 2. On Tuesday morning, September 5th, John steeled himself to pass his first counterfeit note.
Naturally, the first time's always the scariest, and you know, I'm thinking, it sure looks real to me, but you think maybe you're kidding yourself.
After ordering breakfast at this Hardee's outside St. Louis, he nervously handed the cashier a fake 50.
First thing out of the cashier's mouth is, manager, you know, and so, you know, now my heart's blowing out of my chest, and the manager comes over. She looked at front and back and she goes, okay. She threw it in the register and gave me my change. She accepted it.
John would hit 19 more businesses in the St. Louis area that day. Convenience stores, hardware stores, a local mall, anywhere he thought he could spend the money safely. By evening, he had passed more than 500 fake dollars. That night, John holed up in a hotel room in southern Illinois, where he prepped his counterfeit stash for day 2.
So I got paper clips and thread and money hanging all over this hotel room. I probably had $50,000 hanging all over this hotel room drying as I'm laying there waiting to go again tomorrow.
Wednesday, September 6th. John drives to Terre Haute, Indiana, hitting stores all along Route 41 through the center of town.
I didn't feel like I was really victimizing any person. You're victimizing Hardee's, you're victimizing the mall, you're victimizing the hardware store. I didn't feel like I was Jesse James putting a gun to anybody's head, but I knew it was certainly wrong.
By 3 p.m., John decides it's time to move on, having pocketed more than $1,000 of real cash in 2 days. On the way out of Terre Haute, he pulls into this gas station to fill up his minivan. He decides to test his luck with one more cashier.
She just didn't really seem like someone that was going to scrutinize the money. And so I gave her 50, she threw it in the drawer, and I left. Well, I must have no more turned my back, and she hit it with one of those indicator markers that will turn up black if it's counterfeit.
The cashier takes down John's license plate number and calls the Terre Haute Police Department. Lieutenant Bill Bergen is in the area when the call comes in.
I traveled approximately 6 to 8 blocks and happened to look over on a parking lot, and the vehicle sat there.
I had stopped 6 blocks down the road, and I'm reading a road atlas looking for my best way to get to Chicago, and here comes several squad cars that surrounded my van, and I look over in the seat next to me, and there's a briefcase with $150,000 in counterfeit money in it. Well, game over.
When we did tell him what he was suspected of, he was very surprised that he had, I guess, been caught, and became very nervous.
The police found more than $158,000 in counterfeit money and $1,000 in real money in John's van. They later discovered a handful of fakes stuffed into the seat of their squad car, money John had tried to get rid of while he was handcuffed in the back. 4 months later, in an Indianapolis federal court, John pleaded guilty to counterfeiting. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 months in a federal prison, a much lighter sentence than the 15-year maximum.
One of the blessings in the whole thing was I had not spent any of the money. And so when I was caught and arrested, I had all the available funds with me to make complete restitution to the people that I had done wrong to.
Today, John is out of prison. He's hoping to get back into the promotions game, but this time to make an honest buck. The Secret Service will tell you that counterfeiters like John pose a serious threat to the U.S. economy, but not for the reason you think. Each year, around $40 million in counterfeits are pulled from circulation in the U.S., $250 million worldwide. It sounds like a lot, but it's really just a drop in the bucket.
Any amount of counterfeiting concerns us, but I think it's important to note that we have about $560 or $550 billion of U.S. currency in circulation worldwide, and of that, we estimate that only a fraction of 1% is counterfeit.
So if counterfeiting is such a minor problem, then why is it such a major deal? The reason is that the strength of any currency is based on faith. The faith that each bill, each coin, is really worth what it says it's worth. Counterfeiting undermines that faith, causing people to question the integrity of their money.
Counterfeiting is not an economic problem at this time. It's a problem or a concern about the confidence the public would have in their currency. People should be able to trust their currency, accept it willingly, at almost a subliminal level of trust where they know they can exchange it for goods or services and it will always be recognized.
If too many people lose faith in their currency, it can put the whole economy at risk. That's why the Secret Service takes counterfeiting so seriously, because a little can go a long way. It's all part of a battle that's been going on for 2,500 years, a never-ending game of cat and mouse between the governments who make the money and the criminals who fake it. In March 1996, Benjamin Franklin got a facelift. For the first time since 1929, the greenback had been redesigned, and the 100 was the first to come off the presses. Many Americans thought the change was merely a fashion statement, and a bad one at that.
There's more white space, there's less border printing. It looked different. To some people, the reaction was, therefore, it looked phony.
The irony was that the purpose of the redesign was to make the dollar harder to counterfeit. It's no accident, for example, that the most talked about new feature was Franklin himself.
The large engraved portrait is the best single printed security feature we have on the note. People are used to looking at other people's faces. They recognize subtle differences in that face. Therefore, we want to have an emphasis on that feature.
We'll dig deeper into the new dollar later in the program. But first, back to the beginning and the origins of counterfeiting itself, a distinguished tradition of greed and deception that's been around for more than 2,000 years. Money in its earliest form was often as edible as it was valuable. The Aztecs used cocoa beans to pay for goods and services. In India, they used almonds. In Asia, rice. It was a cumbersome and inconvenient form of commerce, but at least there was no counterfeiting. Then, the invention of change changed everything. Coinage originated during the 6th century BC in the Greek province of Lydia.
Lydia was the first to begin using coins, and these were small, effectively ingots of metal that were simply stamped to guarantee their weight and also to guarantee their authenticity.
It didn't take long before some enterprising Lydian realized you could make money by making fake money. The coin on the left is genuine Lydian cash, made from a naturally occurring mixture of gold and silver called electrum. The one on the right is made from a cheaper metal but plated with electrum, one of the earliest known examples of counterfeiting. During the reign of the Lydian king Croesus, said to be the richest man in the world, the use of coins and the craft of counterfeiting them spread throughout the Mediterranean. And so began the endless contest between the counterfeiters and the counterfeited.
There were very strict controls on counterfeiting from the ancient times onward. And in fact, usually the punishment for producing false coins was death, and usually death by some horrible means. You know, boiling in oil or scalding or crucifixion or beheading or something of that sort.
Such harsh sentences weren't just a Western phenomenon. Banknotes like this one from Ming, China, carried the warning that anyone found counterfeiting would be beheaded.
But they also carry a rather nice addition to that. They say that anybody who reports a counterfeiter, first of all, will receive a large reward in silver, but also will receive the entire property of that counterfeiter.
In colonial America, the words "'tis death to counterfeit" were commonly printed on paper money. Often, counterfeiters weren't even considered criminals. They were seen as local folk heroes, Robin Hoods who could give the taxman a poke in the eye.
We have historical accounts of counterfeiters who were cheered as they were taken to be hung, and indeed of crowds who lined the streets and wept as counterfeiters were taken away to be buried after having been executed.
During the Revolutionary War, the British turned counterfeiting on its head. For the first time in history, it was the authorities, not the criminals, who were the ones making fake money. On April 14, 1777, an ad for an unusual sale ran in the pages of the New York Gazette. The business hours were strange, 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. The product was even stranger, counterfeit money at bargain prices. But strangest of all, it turned out, were the advertisers themselves, loyalist agents of the British government.
The whole idea was to give away the counterfeit money and in that way wreck the American economy.
The problem for the colonists started in late 1774 as the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Heading into war with the British, they needed to pay for weapons, supplies, and troops. Only they didn't have any money.
With no native supply of gold or silver, the colonies had long been forced to rely on a bewildering array of untrustworthy and easily forged notes.
The entire American economy was based on paper money. Since they were incapable of producing coins, they didn't have the precious metals, they didn't have the technology.
The colony's leading producer of paper money was the man who now graces the 100, Ben Franklin.
Before Franklin had reached the age of 14, he was probably more knowledgeable about printing than any person in the United States.
Franklin pioneered dozens of anti-counterfeiting measures. One was to incorporate the unique pattern of a leaf into the engraving plate, which made forging the note that resulted more difficult. Another was to print money with flecks of mineral in the paper, the precursor to the red and blue threads randomly dispersed throughout today's dollars. By 1774, Franklin had moved on to diplomacy, so the Continental Congress turned to his former partners, the Philadelphia print shop of Hall and Sellers, to solve the colony's money problem. This was the currency they printed. It was called the Continental, and it was used to pay soldiers and buy munitions. The Continental was not supported by existing reserves. It was backed only by the shaky promise that it could someday be redeemed for Spanish dollars. For the colonists, this meant that faith in their currency and faith in their cause were intertwined. If the war effort started to go downhill, so would their confidence in the Continental, and vice versa. Recognizing this, the British set out to cut the Continental off at its knees. On orders from the Crown, they launched an attack on the new currency using an unprecedented weapon of war, counterfeiting.
The basic reason for the British wanting to counterfeit the Continental money is to destroy the value of the money so that the individuals in the colonies would not accept any of the paper money which was genuine or counterfeit.
To make the fake bills, the British hired loyalists with experience in engraving and printing. Much of the work was done on board ships like this one, the HMS Phoenix, which was moored in British-controlled New York Harbor. British sympathizers were then enlisted to pass the bills into circulation. On one occasion, the Redcoats even devised a kind of Trojan horse to deliver phony Continentals, sneaking pillows full of counterfeits into the supply wagons they sent to British prisoners of war. The plan was for the POWs to use the counterfeits to bribe their way out of captivity. But en route to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the wagons were stopped and searched by American troops who discovered the hidden stash. By this time, the Crown's counterfeiting scheme had become an open secret. The British hoped that by undercutting the Continental, they would wreak havoc on the colonial army. Merchants would refuse to sell its supplies. Soldiers would desert rather than be paid in worthless currency. The counterfeiting contributed to inflation so rampant, George Washington himself declared, "A wagon full of money won't even get you a wagon full of supplies." But for the Americans, belief in their cause proved more important than confidence in their currency. The soldiers stayed loyal, the colonies held together, and trade with the French and Spanish helped prop up the economy. The British counterfeiting scheme, Ben Franklin would later write, had caused a loss to all and the ruin of many. But it had not kept the colonists from claiming their independence. The years between the Revolution and the Civil War would turn out to be a golden age for counterfeiting in America. And this is a monument to it, the only house in the country built from the ground up for counterfeiting. In Adams County, Ohio, in the southernmost part of the state, a house sits on a ridge above the Ohio River. It looks pretty ordinary, but as any good criminal knows, looks can be deceiving. For this is a tale of trapdoors, hidden rooms, and secret drops in the dead of night. The legend of an ordinary-looking house designed and built for one extraordinary purpose: counterfeiting. The first half of the 19th century was a golden age for American counterfeiters. There was no national currency, no greenback, just an unregulated patchwork of more than 1,600 private banks and 7,000 different banknotes.
The quality of many of these notes was not that great, and counterfeiters had just a field day. Probably there were nearly as many counterfeit notes as there were varieties of genuine notes.
It was chaos in a lot of ways, and it affected commerce because can you imagine it would be like everybody writing a check in a way and then putting it in circulation.
The counterfeiters used a variety of methods. Many simply changed either the denomination or the name of the bank on the note. Others were skilled enough to engrave their own plates, and some even forged the money freehand.
There is one story about the penman who sat down at a bar, drew his notes, and made the mistake of handing it to the bartender over a wet bar, and the ink ran.
Publishers did a thriving trade in counterfeit detection reports, funny money guidebooks for merchants that were sometimes several inches thick. It was during this age of economic confusion, or so the story goes, that a counterfeiter named Oliver Tompkins arrived in Adams County to build his dream house. What little is known for sure about Oliver Tompkins starts with this deed.
It was in the spring of 1850 that Oliver Tompkins acquired about 118 acres here on Gift Ridge. It was just within a short period of time that he began construction of his home.
An engraver by training, Tompkins is said to have taken up counterfeiting while living in Cincinnati, 70 miles down the river. But some say he was really from New York City and already on the run from the law when he arrived in Ohio.
I believe that Oliver Tompkins was indeed a con man. I believe that he must have been involved in counterfeiting someplace before he ever came to Adams County because he knew what he was doing.
Oliver's accomplice was a woman named Anne Lovejoy, who may have been his sister or possibly his mistress. Far from the bustle of the big city, Adams County was the perfect place for the pair to set up shop. Together, they built a one-story, white frame house with a bird's-eye view of the Ohio River below. Steamboat traffic brought them a steady stream of customers. They came from Pittsburgh, Portsmouth, and Cincinnati, all for the product Oliver and Ann were selling. Top-quality counterfeit. Cheap. For just $10, you could get a nearly flawless $500 bill. But first, you had to know the rules. The deals, they say, went down like this. On the nights Oliver was open for business, he would place a lantern in the attic window, a signal that could be spotted from the river. The customer would dock at a gully called Tompkins Landing, then make the steep trek up the hillside to the house a mile away.
They had to know in advance how to get in the home. There is a trick lock on the front door. The average citizen could attempt to turn that doorknob and it would appear locked. If you take that knob, however, and jerk it real hard straight up and then turn the knob, the door opens.
Inside the house, a wide hallway led straight back to what at the time was a blank wall. Hidden behind this wall was a secret, windowless room, which could only be reached through a trap door in the attic. It was here that Oliver is said to have plied his trade, meticulously engraving the plates, then using them to churn out phony notes on a hand-cranked press. But his customers didn't know that. All they knew was where to go once they got inside. Above the door in the room to the right was a slot.
And in that slot would be the counterfeit money. You would take out the counterfeit money and exchange it with real money.
The customer would never see anyone else during the trade. But all the while, Oliver would be silently watching him, seated in a secret chamber built into the chimney. Posing as farmers to avoid suspicion, Oliver Tompkins and Anne Lovejoy ran their operation for at least a year, until a fateful purchase brought the law on their trail. One afternoon, the story goes, Anne boarded a riverboat bound for Cincinnati. After making the 70-mile trip, she disembarked and checked into a hotel for the night. The next day, she went into a local general store and bought a black shawl, paying for it with a counterfeit bill and getting genuine currency back in change. But the bill she had tried to pass was quickly identified as a fake.
Someone noticed that this money looked funny and notified authorities, and they began trailing her.
She realized the government men were after her and went off towards her hotel room, probably to pick up her other things she traveled down there with. She threw the shawl in the fireplace, and she left the hotel thinking the shawl would burn, but it didn't.
Instead, it was discovered by the authorities, allowing them to identify the woman who had passed the counterfeit as Anne Lovejoy. But they were too late to catch her. By this time, Anne had escaped on the last boat bound for Adams County. When Anne got back to Tompkins Landing, she rushed up to the house and told Oliver of her narrow escape. They knew the law would soon be closing in. Lately, government agents had been snooping around the place, and legend has it, Oliver had even shot and killed one of them. Their only choice now was to flee. The next day, the authorities finally arrived at Tompkins Landing. Like others before them, they walked the mile to the house, only to find it abandoned and any trace of counterfeiting gone. Legend has it that Oliver and Anne had ridden off to Concord, Kentucky, 6 miles to the east, but not before stashing the evidence in a secret tunnel leading from the house to the riverbank and dynamiting the entrance shut. The tale of the counterfeit house doesn't quite end there, however. In November 1851, Anne Lovejoy apparently returned to the area, this time with a coffin. Oliver, she said, had recently died, and she wanted to bury him in Adams County. The funeral was held in the parlor of the counterfeit house. The coffin was then taken to nearby Fenton Cemetery, where the body of 33-year-old Oliver Tompkins was laid to rest, or so it was said. To this day, many are convinced that the coffin actually held a wax dummy, and that the funeral was just a ruse to throw the law off the counterfeiter's trail. Some even say that Oliver watched the whole thing from one of the secret chimney compartments in the house.
I truly believe that, yes, he did indeed stage his own death, that he is not buried in the Fenton Cemetery. I believe that he carried on his practice elsewhere after he got away from this area with Anne.
In the end, Oliver Tompkins' most convincing counterfeit may well have been his own death. With the start of the Civil War, the golden age of counterfeiting came to an end. Honest Abe would make it much harder for Americans to make a dishonest buck. But the president's strangest role in the history of counterfeiting came after he was assassinated, when a gang of forgers hatched a bizarre plot to steal his corpse and hold it for ransom. It was one of the most bizarre schemes in American history. A 19th century counterfeiting ring plots to rob Lincoln's grave and hold the president's corpse for ransom.
The idea of stealing Lincoln's body sounds fantastic, but as history demonstrates again and again, the most cockamamie schemes are the ones that often work.
Only one thing stood between the criminals and their morbid objective: an agency created just a decade earlier by President Lincoln himself, the United States Secret Service. When the 16th president took office in March 1861, he not only inherited a nation on the verge of civil war, but a monetary system in total disarray. America was a house divided into hundreds of separate currencies. Lincoln knew that if it stayed that way, financing a war would be a war in itself. The solution? The Legal Tender Act of 1862, which authorized the U.S. Treasury to issue paper money for the first time in the nation's history. The new notes were printed in $5, $10, and $20 denominations. Black on the front and green on the back, they quickly earned the nickname greenbacks. And they just as quickly became a tempting target for counterfeiters. By the end of the Civil War, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of all money in circulation was said to be fake.
Shopkeepers couldn't tell the difference between counterfeit bills and genuine bills, and the stability of the economy was at risk.
On April 15, 1865, Lincoln established a new branch of the Treasury Department dedicated to stopping this epidemic, the U.S. Secret Service. It would be one of his last official acts. That night, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. The first director of the Secret Service was a leading authority on counterfeiting named William P. Wood. Wood hired 10 men to work as operatives. He paid them a salary plus $25 for every counterfeiter they captured.
When it first started out, it was more of a psychological boost for people, saying, okay, we finally have some central location that we can report these counterfeit problems to.
During its first year alone, the Secret Service arrested around 200 counterfeiters. But it would be another decade before one of the agency's strangest cases would truly put it on the map. The story starts in 1876 at a Chicago saloon called The Hub on the edge of the Vice District.
The Hub had a reputation of being kind of a gathering place for counterfeit men, and therefore was a prime listening post for the Secret Service. They were always watching who was going in, who was coming out.
In particular, they had their eye on Big Jim Keneally, an Irish immigrant who had spent time in prison for horse theft and counterfeiting. Keneally had come to Chicago from St. Louis, where he ran the largest counterfeit ring in the Midwest.
In those days, counterfeiting generally was run by a gang, and somebody that would head this and get a good engraver, and then they would have various groups distributing it.
Keneally never handled the money directly, so the Secret Service had a very difficult time actually connecting Keneally with the crime.
The key to Keneally's operation was his brilliant engraver, Benjamin Boyd, widely considered the most talented forger in the country. The product of a wealthy Cincinnati family, Boyd was a master at mimicking the steel plates used to print U.S. currency. It was said that none but the best of eyes could detect Boyd's bogus bills.
Benjamin Boyd, at that time in 1875, 1876, is one of the most sought-after men in the entire United States by the U.S. Secret Service.
But on October 20th, 1875, Boyd was captured by Secret Service Captain Patrick Terrell after an 8-month chase through 5 states. The engraver was found guilty of counterfeiting and sentenced to 10 years in prison.
Big Jim Keneally is really out of business until he can get Boyd back, because he doesn't have any other engraver that can do the kind of work that Boyd did. So he immediately starts a master plan to try and get him out of prison.
The plan was as simple as it was ghastly. Keneally and his gang would rob President Lincoln's grave and hold his coffin hostage. The corpse of the martyred president was as close to a sacred relic as America had. The counterfeiters figured that once it was in their hands, the government would have to give in to their demands: $200,000 cash and the release of their engraver, Benjamin Boyd, from prison. It was a plan that sounded less preposterous then than it does today.
At this time, stealing the corpses of wealthy family members and holding them for ransom was a frequent occurrence.
The scheme took shape at the Hub, where by this time Keneally had become a silent partner. He enlisted 2 other men from the saloon to help out: Terrence Mullen, the Hub's proprietor, and a patron named Jack Hughes, who had gained a reputation as a shover, someone who shoves or passes counterfeit money into circulation. The trio had plenty of criminal expertise, but they were missing one key ingredient: an experienced grave robber. That's when Louis Swagles came along.
Louis Swiggles was himself a petty crook and criminal. He had served time in the county jail and in the state prison system.
Swiggles walked into the saloon professing to be Chicago's top body snatcher, a ghoulish occupation that medical schools at the time relied on for cadavers.
He claimed that he knew how he could get them in to the Lincoln tomb, get the body, and get it out.
What Keneally and his gang didn't know was that their new partner was a paid informant for the Secret Service, and that Captain Terrell, the man who had captured the engraver Benjamin Boyd, was being told their every move. The plot to steal Lincoln's body was set to go down November 7, 1876, the night of the presidential election.
The crooks decided that this would be the perfect time when everybody would be clustered around downtown Springfield where the telegraph office was located, listening to the returns as they were reported from the states.
As night began to fall and polling came to a close, the three men made their way to the cemetery. Lincoln's gravesite was divided into two parts. In front was Memorial Hall, a monument dedicated to the life of the slain president. In back was the catacomb, where the actual tomb was located.
The idea was they would break the lock on the tomb, they would pry open the marble sarcophagus, take out the casket, and put it on the back of a wagon.
Meanwhile, Captain Terrell and his agents had already arrived at the cemetery. Thanks to their informant, Louis Swiggles, they were one step ahead of the counterfeiters. Their plan was to hide inside Memorial Hall until Swiggles gave them a signal, then they'd rush over to the tomb and catch the grave robbers in the act. Finally, they heard Keneally's gang arrive at the catacomb. Using these cutters, Terrence Mullen broke the lock. Entering the catacomb, the criminals saw the sarcophagus of President Lincoln. With this axe, Mullen pried off the lid, then a second lid, revealing the coffin itself.
Unfortunately, Mullen asked Schwengels to hold the lantern for them. So when he's holding the light, he can't get out the door and go around on the other side and whisper to the detectives that what's going on.
As the men began lifting the coffin from its resting place, Mullen ordered Swiggles to fetch the waiting wagon. Swiggles knew this was his chance to signal the Secret Service. He hurried out of the catacomb and ran around to Memorial Hall. Hearing his sign, Captain Terrell and his men raced out of the vault, guns drawn. But by this time, the grave robbers had stepped out of the catacomb to take a break. When they heard the commotion, they scattered, escaping into the woods. Bursting into the tomb, the detectives found the marble sarcophagus open and a broken lock, chisel, and axe lying on the floor. Lincoln's coffin was intact, but the grave robbers were long gone. 2 days later, the Chicago Tribune broke the story of the failed plot to steal Lincoln's body.
The public reaction after the attempt was done was one of incredulity, actually, in many regards. Most people refused to believe it.
Pundits called it a prank, a manufactured story, a political dirty trick. Yet by the end of the week, when the Secret Service tracked Mullen and Hughes down at the hub, the truth of the story was no longer in doubt. The Chicago Times wrote of the two crooks that their attempted crime so remarkable for its originality, fiendishness, and daring has given them a fame almost worldwide in a day. For the Secret Service, the case was a watershed.
All of a sudden, the Secret Service is now beginning to get more recognition, more understanding, much like the Dillinger capture by the FBI.
The two grave robbers were convicted for larceny and sentenced to a year in prison. But the leader of the gang, Big Jim Keneally, was never officially tied to the crime. As for Benjamin Boyd, the master engraver whose arrest inspired it all, he remained behind bars for the next 9 years, during which time counterfeiting in the Midwest almost completely dried up. In 1939, the Secret Service released its first promotional film, a how-to guide for detecting phony greenbacks.
It becomes increasingly difficult for the counterfeiter to ply his trade.
It was the heart of the Great Depression, and counterfeiting was rampant. What no one could foresee was that the most dangerous counterfeiting scheme in history would soon take shape, not in America, but in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. Counterfeiting entered the 20th century as an established weapon of war. It would be left to Nazi Germany to take it to its terrible extreme. It was here at this site that Hitler's secret service, the Sicherheitsdienst, oversaw the largest counterfeiting operation in history. But it was not German spies who did the dirty work. The site was part of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and the men who made the counterfeits were Jewish prisoners. In the fall of 1940, as the Luftwaffe unleashed its fire over London, the Nazis hatched a secret plan to launch a second front from the sky. Instead of bombs, German planes would drop bills, millions of counterfeit pound notes, scattered over England in an all-out economic blitzkrieg.
If people could go on the streets and pick up 10-pound notes, a dozen of them, you would have an extraordinary inflation that would destroy the whole economy.
The pound was one of the most powerful currencies on earth. It bore the imprint of monarchy and connected an empire. With its calligraphic script and ornate engraving, the pound note posed a challenge to even the most skilled counterfeiter.
Figurative drawing is often regarded as something that the average forger can't reproduce because they haven't got the skill.
The British note seems very simple, black and white, anybody can do it, forget it. The size of the figures have to be so close, almost to defy the human eye.
The Sicherheitsdienst was already in the business of counterfeiting. For years, it had operated a department devoted to forging passports and foreign documents for use in wartime espionage. But even its best craftsmen were unable to match the complicated design of the British pound. To succeed where they had failed, the Nazis turned to a population branded by Hitler as inferior and marked for extermination: the Jews. In 1940, Paul Landau was just a boy, an 18-year-old French Jew growing up in Paris. On June 14, 1940, his life turned upside down. That day, Hitler's troops occupied Paris and began imposing severe restrictions on the city's Jews. By 1942, the Nazis had started deporting them. On September 8th, Paul and his 25-year-old brother Jacques were detained. Less than 2 weeks later, they were shipped by train to a forced labor camp outside France. Landau recalled his experiences in a 1991 interview.
My brother said, listen, we are strong, we are young, they send us to Germany. They make us work, so what? So we'll work to the end of the war, and we'll survive the war that way. I arrived in Germany in September 42. By Christmas, I couldn't walk anymore.
Along with thousands of others, the Landau brothers were forced to build highways and railroads for the Nazis. The work was so arduous that in May 1943, Jacques contracted pneumonia and died. 6 months later, Paul was sent to the death camp at Auschwitz, where more than 1 million Jews would be killed by the end of the war. But one morning, by extraordinary chance, Paul found an unlikely savior.
We stood in front of a man with 4 stars. He was from the Sicherheitsdienst. He needed people to work, and he asked everyone what his profession was.
The man was Bernhard Kruger, a 40-year-old Nazi officer who had been assigned to choose Jewish prisoners to counterfeit the British pound.
He said, who is in the printing business here? Who is in the paper handling business? Who is a photographer? And they stepped forward.
55 of us were chosen in Auschwitz. On the 26th of December, we left Auschwitz by train to an unknown destination.
They were headed here, to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, 25 miles north of Berlin. Paul was given a uniform and a number. Then he and his fellow inmates were locked into a secret barracks, where for the first time they learned why they had been brought together.
Behind me, we see the area where the barrack number 19 was located. In this barrack, the Nazis, the SS, established in autumn 1942 the counterfeit unit, a small, perfectly equipped printing factory.
More than 140 men would eventually be chosen to take part in the super-secret operation. Paul's job was to carefully inspect each new series of counterfeit notes for flaws.
We were given a stack of 500 banknotes with a little box on an incline, a matte glass, with a light underneath and a light above.
Some of the prisoners said we should put deliberate imperfections so that the British would catch on right away. But the other prisoners said, look, we may have a chance to live. We stop sabotaging it, we're dead.
Of course, the inmates had no real choice. They were under the gun. Barracks 19 was completely isolated. Barbed wire separated it from the rest of the camp. A special detachment of SS guards patrolled the area. The prisoners left the barracks for one reason only.
We went once a week to the shower. We had to line up to be counted. We had to turn our pockets inside out. You know, in the pants, we had pockets here. We had to turn them inside out to prove that we didn't have any paper or banknotes or anything with us.
Officer Kruger warned the men against talking to anyone about the operation or trying to escape.
When a prisoner was sick and had to be sent to the medical center of the camp, he was guarded by SS men, so that it was impossible for him to come into contact with other people, other prisoners. And we know that when members of the counterfeit unit were severely sick, they were killed.
The likelihood that they would not survive the war haunted the inmates. They knew their lives were disposable.
They had no illusions about what would happen to them. Nobody was selling daydreams there. They knew goddamn well what was happening in the rest of Germany.
By the summer of 1943, Barracks 19 had become a fully functioning counterfeit factory, with a paper mill and presses capable of churning out thousands of pound notes a day. To test the quality of the finished notes, Nazi agents deposited some at a large Berlin bank, then tipped off tellers to a rumored rash of counterfeits. Experts called in by the tellers pronounced the bills genuine.
Those were some of the best counterfeits of British banknotes ever produced. The quality of the paper was excellent, the watermark was excellent, the engraving was excellent.
They were the most dangerous counterfeits ever.
In the end, the counterfeiters would generate $600 million worth of British banknotes, the equivalent of $5 billion today. But the planned assault on England's economy never took place. The Luftwaffe lost the air war over England, and with it, the chance to bombard Britain with counterfeit bills. Instead, the Nazis fed the fake currency into circulation all over Europe. They used it to pay for espionage and arms. They bought up gold, silver, art, and jewelry. They even financed the rescue of deposed Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from a prison on the island of Sardinia. The Sachsenhausen unit was so successful that by the beginning of 1944, the Nazis were ready to shut it down. They had all the money they needed. But Nazi officer Bernhard Kruger knew that stopping the counterfeit operation could spell the end for him and his prisoners. He would most likely be transferred to the perilous Russian front. His counterfeiters would be killed.
That's when Kruger became very persuasive and finally persuaded his boss to let them go work on a dollar bill.
Kruger ordered his counterfeiters to progress as slowly as possible in their efforts to copy the greenback. Stalling was the only thing that would save them.
They were his ticket to keep him out of the Russian front. He needed them, just as they needed him. It was a Classic symbiotic relationship.
The tactic worked. The Nazis kept the counterfeit project going.
They didn't care about our life, but as long as they wanted to continue printing things, they needed us.
In April 1945, with American and Russian troops closing in on Berlin, the Nazis transported the entire counterfeiting operation by train to Redl-Ziff, a secret site high in the Austrian Alps. On May 3rd, the counterfeiters were moved again, this time without their equipment.
We didn't take our machinery, so we were all convinced that we were going to a camp to be liquidated.
The guards of the camp went to Kruger and said, the operation is finished. Shouldn't we kill off these Jews? Kruger looked at him and said, are you crazy? You touch them now, you're a dead man. The Allies will come after you.
3 days later, the war in Europe ended. The counterfeiters were finally free.
The 6th of May, around 1 or 2 p.m. in the afternoon, one American tank came into the camp. This was our liberation.
In the years that followed, the prisoners of the Nazi counterfeit unit tried to resume their lives as best they could. Paul Landau found his way back to Paris, where he was reunited with the members of his family who had survived the war. In 1951, Paul emigrated to Canada to begin a new life and to start a family. For more than a decade after the war, the story of the Nazi counterfeit unit remained shrouded in secrecy and rumor. Then, in 1959, the proof surfaced.
Strange echoes of the World War have come from the waters of Lake Toplitzer in Austria. Men salvaging war material uncovered some £5 notes.
They'd been sunk in the lake, and some were on anchors with buoyancies about 50 feet beneath the surface, as if somebody had intended at some point or other to come back and reclaim them.
The notes had a face value of £700 million. But by this time, the Bank of England, which had known about the Nazi scheme since late in the war, had redesigned Britain's currency. Laced into each note was a slender silver thread, a new device to foil counterfeiters to come, and a glinting reminder of the terrible episode just past. 30 years after the Nazis targeted the British pound, another flawless fake would begin circulating in London. The elusive counterfeiter was so skilled, detectives called him the Magician. But he would soon meet his match in an American in Scotland Yard. 30 years after the Nazis schemed to break the Bank of England, Britain faced a new counterfeit threat. A forger so skilled, authorities dubbed him the Magician. Churning out uncannily accurate £5 notes, the Magician confounded the fabled detectives of Scotland Yard.
He was like the Scarlet Pimpernel. They seek him here, they seek him there, the police seek him everywhere. But he was untouchable.
In a game that would soon be overrun by high-tech hacks, the Magician was an artist, a master at his criminal craft. But he would eventually be unmasked by a most unlikely detective, an American, in Scotland Yard. In the fall of 1974, New Yorker Mark Yarry was a brash young businessman on the lookout for adventure.
I'm the kind of guy who would like to try anything once. Sometimes it can get you in a lot of trouble, and sometimes put you into situations that when you reflect later saying, why the hell did I ever do that?
2 years before, Yarry and a partner had crossed the Alps in a hot air balloon, the first time in history that feat had been accomplished. Now he was living in London, on assignment for an American optical company. His very first day there, a chance encounter would put his career on hold and lead to the adventure of a lifetime. That morning, September 24th, Yarry left his house for a full schedule of business meetings. To save time, he hailed a cab and hired the driver to stay with him the full day. Mired in typical London traffic, Yarry soon got to talking with his temporary chauffeur.
Americans read about how friendly London cabbies are, and they are. And during the course of conversation, I mentioned him. I was a philatelist, someone interested in stamps. And one of the things I had been interested in collecting were counterfeits.
At the word counterfeit, the cabbie seemed to perk up.
He said, oh, was I interested in forged currency? And when he said that to me, the first thing that came to my mind was the German counterfeiting of the 5-pound note.
By now, the notorious Nazi counterfeits known as German white fivers were valuable collector's items. Eager to purchase some, Jari invited the driver to bring a batch of notes to his house in 2 days' time. It wasn't long before the American started having second thoughts.
I got home and I sat down and I had a drink. Something in my brain just said, there's something wrong. Am I dealing with someone who's a counterfeiter?
That evening, Jari placed a call to Scotland Yard, the legendary British police force. When Jim Goldie, a detective with the Yard's anti-counterfeiting division, arrived at work the next morning, he was handed an unusual message.
Overnight, the information room had received a call from a cranky American who had been offered some counterfeit money by a taxi driver.
Just 1 day later, Goldie was stationed upstairs in Mark Jari's bedroom, waiting to find out if the cabbie was actually selling fake money.
I decided that the proof of the pudding, of course, would be in eating if the taxi driver did come back with the samples, and then, of course, we would move on to the next stage of the inquiry.
When the cabbie arrived, he got right down to business.
He puts his hand into his pocket, and out come 5-pound notes. And these are certainly not German white fivers. These are 5 identical serial numbered British 5-pound present-day notes.
As soon as the cabbie left, Jari rushed upstairs brandishing the pound notes he'd just purchased. The Scotland Yard detective studied them closely, feeling them slowly, then holding one up to the light.
He picked it up and he looked at the front, and he flipped it over and he looked at the back, and he said, "Oh my God, it's the magician."
By the time he met the American in the fall of '74, Jim Goldie had already been hunting the magician for 8 months. The counterfeiter's work was nearly flawless, a combination of painstaking craftsmanship and high-quality photographic duplication.
Here we had a series of notes confirmed by the Bank of England as being the best they'd ever seen.
All they were missing was the metal security thread shot through every genuine British pound. Electronic sorters at the Bank of England had detected this flaw, the only way officials had learned of the mysterious magician's existence. It was a secret bank officials desperately wanted to keep. Already faced with rampant inflation, rising unemployment, and the ever-present threat of IRA violence, they believed the public's faith in the economy was at stake.
If he had been able to go on and on and on, churning out counterfeit notes, then that could have a very, very serious effect on the British public's confidence in its own currency.
Detective Goldie hoped to capture the magician before news of the counterfeits leaked out. Mark Jari's cabbie was his most promising lead. The driver, Goldie figured, must be a distributor, a middleman who allowed the magician himself to stay underground.
That's the way that most printers operate. They keep themselves well removed from the action and allow the money to go through various links in the chain and get the payments without really exposing themselves.
Goldie knew the magician had to be reeled in carefully. He also knew he needed Mark Jari's help to go forward. But first, he'd have to convince his superiors at Scotland Yard.
They had a lot of major concerns. One, I'm an American. Number two, what is their liability? If I get hurt, something happens to me, are they liable?
I had to side with either Jari or the Yard, and I decided to go with Jari because I really felt that we were close on the trail of this man.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, my partner Goldie and I mean, we were into it by now. The game was on. The game was afoot.
After getting the go-ahead from Scotland Yard, Goldie and Jari now tried to concoct a plan that would get them past the cabbie and to the magician. But the counterfeiter kept refusing to meet with Jari in person.
I had to come up with something that was going to tantalize the magician. I had to be somebody who was obviously someone of some power.
One afternoon, Yari improvised a solution. He told the cabbie he was really an American mafioso, and Goldie was his muscle.
Mark, on the spur of the moment, became concerned downstairs, ran upstairs and said to me, "You've got to come down. Yeah, you're my bodyguard."
It was very, very important to the whole image that I look like someone who was, you know, sort of a major crime figure.
Yari was very impressive. He knew how to press the right buttons to try and get the quickest result.
With the taxi driver as their go-between, Yari and Goldie used their fictitious new personas to lure the magician out of hiding.
I decided to offer the magician, aside from money, something much more attractive. What I wanted him to do was to come to the United States. I would set him up with the latest equipment in a, quote, cloistered environment, and he could produce counterfeit U.S. currency.
It was an offer the magician couldn't refuse. On the afternoon of November 13th, 6 weeks after his first fateful cab ride, Mark Yari stood waiting on a street corner in the quiet London suburb of Kennington. A white Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb and he climbed inside. High above the city, a police helicopter tracked the car as it drove away.
Scotland Yard are absolutely terrified that I'm going to get into some car with some counterfeiter and go driving off into the sunset. They'd call Goldie and say, "Can't you control that American? Can't you control that son of a bitch?"
But within minutes, the helicopter had lost the car in London's thick fog. Yari was now on his own, face to face with the magician.
There's a very dapper man, about 40, very well dressed. I actually like the guy. He's interesting and he's colorful.
As the magician drove him around the city, Yari talked about his fictional syndicate, reiterating its proposal to bring the counterfeiter to the U.S. to make fake dollars. He also offered to pay 15,000 genuine pounds for 50,000 in counterfeit. The magician agreed to the deal. As soon as the meeting ended, Yari called Goldie with the news.
Jim Goldie is at my house drinking scotch, getting pissed out of his mind, worried sick. They don't know where I am. I said, "We got a real problem, Jim. I need the money."
On November 20th, Mark Yari prepared to meet the magician at his home. With the cooperation of the Bank of England, Scotland Yard had reluctantly provided the money he needed to make the deal. A bug was hidden inside the living room heating vent to record the exchange. Goldie waited at the house with Yari. Finally, the counterfeiter and the cabbie arrived. Over brandy and scotch, the magician's easy touch was on full display.
Everything was nice and relaxed. He came in, he was very dapper, grey-haired, camel coat, nice suit, gold cigarette case, proper businessman.
The magician couldn't resist revealing some of his tricks.
The counterfeiter was so proud. He said, "Well, look, what you do is you take some talcum powder and you put it on the notes, and you take the notes and you throw them into the dryer, the clothes dryer, and you run it for about 1.5 minutes, and it crisps up the notes."
The deal went smoothly. 15,000 pounds cash for 50,000 in counterfeit. Finally, the magician turned to leave. As he walked out the door, Scotland Yard sprung its trap.
All hell broke loose. The cops were everywhere. They arrested him. The money was recovered.
As the officers surrounded him, he glanced round and looked up at the window, and he appeared to be looking in the direction of Mr. Yari.
It was a very sad moment. I mean, the game, for me and for Goldie, we'd already won. But the consequences of something happening to this guy who I kind of liked at this point, I didn't want the consequences. But at the end of the day, I didn't have any choice.
On June 18, 1975, the magician, a 44-year-old engineer named Cyril Fentiman, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for counterfeiting.
His principal motive for doing what he did was just plain old-fashioned greed.
Though the case made headlines, no photographs of Fentiman were ever released. For Mark Yari, the adventure was over. It had been a thrilling chase. and the American had seen more than a little of himself in the sophisticated counterfeiter.
It was almost kind of a telepathic thing. He and I were involved in a chess game, and we were matching wits with each other.
5 years later, with the magician now out of prison, Yari tried to make it up to him.
I invited the senior detectives to a very elegant dinner, and I set a place at the table for the magician. He was out of jail, and I invited him to come. Of course, he never showed up.
The American wanted to relive the adventure, but the magician had already vanished. To this day, he's never been heard from again. In the last 25 years, counterfeiters like the magician have become an endangered species. Technology has made their craft obsolete. Today, anyone with a computer can become a counterfeiter. That's why, in the 1990s, the U.S. government went back to the drawing board and reinvented the way they make a buck. Money. You use it, you need it, and chances are you want more of it. But do you ever really question the thing itself? What it looks like, how it feels in your hand, and most importantly, whether it's real or not? If you're like most of us, the answer is no. And the people who work here want to keep it that way. Welcome to the new headquarters of the U.S. Secret Service in Washington, D.C. Ground zero in the fight to make sure that the world's most trusted currency remains just that. Every day, counterfeit specialists like Lorelei Pagano use high-tech weapons to combat a crime almost as old as money itself.
All of our equipment that we have basically serves two purposes. The first and most obvious would be to evaluate the counterfeit. The second is for analysis on any potential security features that may go into new currency designs.
These machines make it hard for a counterfeiter to hide. They allow the Secret Service to break a fake down to its constituent parts, then track it to a specific copier or printer.
A key element in a counterfeit note is the ink that was used to produce the counterfeit. With this method, we're able to identify the manufacturer of the ink, say in inkjet cases. So we can identify whether it's a Hewlett-Packard or an Epson or a Canon and so on.
The Secret Service had been guarding the dollar since 1865, nearly 40 years before it started guarding the president. Sometimes its enforcement can seem a little overzealous. In one 1998 raid, agents confiscated all the fake dollars printed by a 7th grade teacher in California for a class project. Even though the bills had the teacher's picture printed on the front and pink teddy bears stamped on the back. But such vigilance is warranted, agents say, in part because Americans may just have too much faith in the authenticity of the wad in their wallet.
Ultimately, if the public doesn't look at their money, you could put a neon sign on there, and you could put every type and size of anti-counterfeiting feature in your currency. It won't work.
We are victims of our own success. The number of counterfeit notes in circulation is extremely low. Most of us have never gotten a counterfeit or had an economic loss. Because of that, we trust our currency so well, we tend not to look at it.
That's changed a bit in the past few years, if only because for the first time in most of our lives, our money actually looks different. Starting in 1996, every denomination was redesigned, but the $1 bill, which was spared in part because it's so seldom the target of counterfeiters. The goal of this overhaul was to make a counterfeit harder to produce and easier to spot. In fact, nearly every step in the process of making a buck involves something to keep someone from faking one. The dollar's first line of defense is located here in Dalton, Massachusetts. For more than 100 years, Crane & Company has been the sole provider of secure banknote paper for the U.S. government. One of the biggest reasons your money is worth more than the paper it's printed on is the paper it's printed on.
We find that most often experienced money handlers tell us that they notice a suspected counterfeit note by the very feel of the note. The paper itself is one of our best security features.
Making money feel like money is the most difficult challenge for a counterfeiter.
The counterfeiter today
relies generally on commercially available paper, and there is no paper like currency paper available in the commercial world.
Crane's recipe starts with bales of cotton and linen fiber, which are fed into this enormous boiler and pressure cooked for nearly 2 hours. The cooked cotton is then cleaned, pressed, bleached, and further refined. At this stage, the first of several additional security features is added: red and blue nylon fibers, which get randomly dispersed throughout the milky pulp. It's an age-old anti-counterfeiting trick pioneered by Ben Franklin and designed to make the paper harder to duplicate.
You can see the inclusion of these fibers in the substance of the paper. They're not printed on, they're actually incorporated in the paper.
Keep inspecting any genuine greenback, and you'll soon spot the other 2 security devices worked into the paper. One is a strip of this metallic thread, embedded into each bill. The thread goes a different place in each denomination. Here, in the 20, it's placed on the left-hand side. Though the thread is visible to the naked eye, it doesn't show up in reflected light, the kind of light used in copiers and scanners. But when it's held under ultraviolet light, it gives off a fluorescent glow, a different color for each denomination. That's why cashiers will often run a bill under ultraviolet light before accepting it. The final security feature is the watermark, the silhouette that serves as Crane's authenticating signature.
If you hold the note up to a light source, you can see the watermark. This depicts the same historical figure that appears in the portrait, and this watermark is extremely difficult to replicate.
This is the raw material of American currency, instantly recognizable to the touch and almost impossible to imitate. Each year, Crane's ships enough paper to make 9 billion notes to its prized client in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Treasury's Bureau of Engraving and Printing. It's here that money paper is turned into paper money, and a whole new layer of anti-counterfeit security is added to the mix. When the decision was made to revamp the dollar, designers like Peter Kachi knew the devil for counterfeiters would be in the details. That's why they included a series of minute features intended to trip up even the most precise copy machine.
We have the micro lettering, which looks like a line until you really get up close, and then you could read what's contained in that micro lettering.
Micro lettering can be found along the edges of the portrait and within the denomination number in the lower left-hand corner of the bill. While the portrait on the front is intentionally oversized, the lines behind it are drawn deliberately narrow. If you try to reproduce the bill on a photocopier, the lines around the portrait will blur. Once the design of a note is set in stone, it then has to be set in steel. Engravers meticulously handcraft the master plates for each denomination. Copies of these master plates are then fitted onto a high-speed, high-impact press like this one. The press forces the plates down on the paper with 20 tons of pressure per square inch, infusing the ink, black on front, green on back, into the note.
The image is actually below the surface of the plate, and the paper is pushed under tremendous pressure into the engraved lines, and the ink is transferred.
It's a type of printing known as intaglio, and it helps give the dollar its distinctive look and feel. At this point, the final security feature is added: color shifting or optical variable ink, which is used to print the number in the lower right-hand corner of the note and is virtually impossible to simulate.
By shifting the note back and forth in a light source, one can see that the colors of the ink vary from green to black.
Color shifting ink in the lower right of the note is definitely a good street-level authentication device. If it doesn't shift, then you should be extraordinarily suspicious of that note.
Every day, the Bureau pumps out 37 million greenbacks. The new notes are stacked, packed into bricks of 4,000, and shipped to the Federal Reserve, which issues them to local banks. Each note is a kind of obstacle course for counterfeiters.
The counterfeiter never knows what the next person they're going to pass that note to is going to focus on. Is it going to be the watermark? Is it going to be the color shifting ink? Is it going to be the embedded thread? Are they going to put it under a UV light? So now the counterfeiter has to try and beat everything.
If a counterfeit isn't caught, it usually finds its way back to one of the 12 regional branches of the Federal Reserve, like this one in Chicago. Each of these glass carts contains used money, up to $40 million worth. Some of it will be shredded, some of it will be recirculated, and some of it will be identified by these scanners as counterfeit and sent to the Secret Service for analysis. Within months of the introduction of the new 100, the first fakes started coming in.
When we undertook the redesign, we did not believe we would create a counterfeit-proof banknote. A counterfeit-proof banknote does not exist.
Technology has made it even harder for the Secret Service to stay ahead of the counterfeiters. In the mid-1990s, less than 1% of all the counterfeit pulled from circulation was made using a digital device, a copier, computer, or scanner. Today, that figure is over 40%.
These are the people now that the Secret Service are becoming concerned about. You know, it's no longer the one counterfeiter with all of his talents who goes out and makes 1 million counterfeits. It's going to be those million people out there who are going to go out and make 1 and 2 and 3 counterfeits.
Every day you hear about some kid cranking out a couple 20s out of his computer and trying to pass them at the local whatever. And that's happening a lot.
But it's not just the teenager in Peoria the Secret Service has to worry about.
It's a borderless economy, and we are now seeing counterfeit notes that are made via computer, imaged in, and sent across the world, downloaded, printed, and ultimately in a matter of minutes.
Counterfeiting has gone global, and it's no coincidence that the most dangerous fakes of all are coming from the cocaine trafficking capital of the world. In an age of computers and credit cards, cold, hard cash can seem like an endangered species. Not so, say the people who manufacture it.
10 or 15 years ago, we produced about 4 billion notes a year. Currently, we're producing 9 billion notes a year, so that the use of currency has increased, not decreased.
Surprisingly, most of these notes are being used beyond America's borders.
It's estimated that about $480 billion in U.S. currency is in circulation worldwide at any given day. And 2/3 of that currency is in circulation overseas.
The U.S. currency is the de facto world currency, so not only do we use it here in the United States, but people around the world want the U.S. dollar and use the U.S. dollar.
And inevitably, some fake it. The dollar's popularity makes it a juicy mark for counterfeiters around the globe. Every year, more than $100 million worth of phony greenbacks are seized abroad. And 80% of those come from a single nation, Colombia. With its deadly mix of drug trafficking, terrorism, and corruption, Colombia is considered by many the most dangerous country in the world. Its dense jungles shield the cartels that produce more than 3/4 of the world's cocaine. The money from the drug trade, in turn, supports a cottage industry of remarkably skilled counterfeiters. Their most common and effective technique is to bleach the ink off a $1 bill, then print a fake 100 on the blank paper. At first, the drug cartels used this counterfeit cash to buy coca paste from unsuspecting suppliers in other South American countries. But its quality was so good that more and more of it began finding its way to the United States. In 1999, fully 1/3 of all the counterfeit dollars seized by the Secret Service in the U.S. came from Colombia. The flood of fakes has forced the Secret Service to take action.
We have permanent Secret Service personnel stationed in Bogota. We have had very good success with our Colombian law enforcement counterparts.
On November 19, 2000, their collaboration paid off spectacularly. That morning, agents of Colombia's Special Police Force, in conjunction with the U.S. Secret Service, raided an underground hideaway in Valle de Coaca, an isolated region west of Bogota. Carved into a mountainside, its entrance concealed by a thick grove of banana trees, was this 15 by 20-foot room, a fully functioning counterfeit factory in the middle of nowhere.
Everything you need to make dollars is here. And this room, which is like a bunker, was built with sophisticated engineering techniques.
In piles around the room lay $3 million worth of phony bills, most of them hundreds, the international counterfeit of choice.
Outside the country, there's less use of credit cards, personal checks, and so much more cash is carried. So the $100 denomination would be a greater target outside the United States.
Colombian officials believe the operation had been in business for 10 years and may have pumped out more than $1 billion in counterfeit. But even this, one of the biggest counterfeiting busts in history, will do little to staunch the flow of copies coming from Colombia, or anywhere else in the world for that matter. The fact is, the dollar's an irresistible target, and even after the recent redesign, it's a long way from the cutting edge of anti-counterfeiting. Here at American Banknote Holographics in Elmsford, New York, they make one of the most effective new weapons in the war on counterfeiting, the hologram. Holograms are reflective patches that literally foil color copiers, which can't reproduce bright metallic colors.
There is not a color copier on the marketplace today that is capable of picking up a hologram.
Easy to recognize and hard to replicate, holograms were first used in the early 80s by credit card companies concerned about fraud. Since then, 20 countries have incorporated them into their currencies, and when the euro is introduced in 2002, it will have them too. Indeed, other nations have been far more aggressive than the U.S. in reshaping their currencies to ward off counterfeiters.
A good example is the Austrian note. It incorporates a kinogram. This is a foil patch which, as the note is tilted, Mozart takes from a left-hand portrait to a right hand. It's a feature that is very difficult to duplicate.
Australia, in particular, is a pioneer in currency design. Notes there are no longer even made of paper.
The Australians have completely changed their currency to plastic, and they use clear areas that you can see through. Very difficult to do on a copier, and has a whole different feel to the note.
So why haven't those who designed the dollar embraced these new security features? One reason, they say, is tradition. The power of the dollar is based in part on the perception of its stability. When the dollar itself is altered, as it was in 1996, that perception can be shaken. Our currency may somehow seem less permanent, less trustworthy. That's why it took 60 years for the Treasury to revamp the greenback, and why the changes only went so far.
The 1996 design is a very traditional American design. It reflects our values, it reflects our traditions.
Yet tradition is a double-edged sword. The less the dollar changes, the easier it is to counterfeit. To make it a moving target, the Treasury Department is expected to roll out a new redesign every 7 to 10 years. If you're still getting used to the 1996 changes, you'd better get ready. Another round is on the way, perhaps as early as 2003. Imagine a greenback with red in it. Dollars that come in 6 different sizes. How about a holographic Ben Franklin on plastic paper? Any of these is possible. If not now, then in the not-too-distant future.
We'll consider everything. We'll consider the things that you see on foreign currencies, the use of color, the use of holograms or other foil-type features, so that we can stay ahead of technology and we can make sure that the world public can trust U.S. currency.
Lately, the government has been cooperating with high-tech companies to find ways to stop counterfeiting before it starts. Here at Xerox, engineers are working with the Secret Service to develop so-called smart software. The way it works is that if someone tries to print the image of a bill, the software will either stop the printing process or print something over the image that renders it unusable. In this way, the engineers hope to make the copiers and computers counterfeit-proof. And so the game continues. The government tries to outwit the counterfeiters, and the counterfeiters try to outfox the government. It's a crime as old as currency and as universal as ambition, desperation, and greed. A crime that will continue as long as there's money to counterfeit.
There is no panacea. There is no silver bullet feature out there that will preclude counterfeiting. Anything that we can reproduce can in fact be simulated, duplicated in some fashion.
Can it be stopped? Probably not. Where there's an opportunity, somebody will find a way to either defeat or to challenge the technologies.
Any country, any government that produces currency is always trying to stay one step ahead of the forger. Any person who's involved in counterfeiting will always tell you the same thing. As fast as we change it, the crooks are there with the technology to beat it.
I think a lot of people have often thought, boy, I wish I could print this stuff. You know, life would be a lot easier if I could sure make it.
According to the Federal Reserve, one of the easiest ways to detect counterfeit currency is to let your fingers do the walking. As we've seen, genuine bills are made from a unique blend of cotton and linen, giving them that distinctive, strong, and crisp feel. An old myth is to try rubbing the note on a piece of paper. Unfortunately, the ink can be rubbed off genuine as well as counterfeit notes. And only an experienced money handler like a bank teller knows for sure. But beware, it's best to check money before accepting it, because if it is a fake, you assume the loss.